these clouded eyes of mine. Pour your cooling water words, 'cause my mind's been burning, 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 burning. Oh, beloved guide, a drop is all I ask of grace you freely give. I'll make it last, accept me as your own, 'cause I'm trying to find my way home. in this world would do. I am waiting for you still. They say, don't run away. Let it echo through your veins. The memory of your name. Don't run away. Ashnisha.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wisdom Wednesdays. Graham, Manya, Amber, Dana. So nice to have you all joining us. Before we get started, and while we wait for people to join the meeting, we'll start with a quick icebreaker to get our brains working a little bit. And this might be an icebreaker or a question you may have heard of before, but I think it's one that carries a lot of weight. And the question is, if you were stuck on an island, what would you do? I guess there's a fun twist to this one because normally the question is what would you bring? But if you're stuck on an island, what would you do? Would you be freaking out? Would you throw a party? Would you befriend the monkeys? No wrong answers.
I was gonna say the logical thing that I would try to do is ask for help, like kind of go around helplessly trying to look for people, but I think my initial reaction would be just like shock and panic.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear you. Your mic was really quiet, but I heard go out, ask for help.
Is this better?
Yes,
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I was just saying go out for help and then like initially panic. But yeah.
panic. Okay, Amber also says freak out a bit. Brad says I would try to find water. I mean, technically be surrounded by water, but I'm guessing drinking water is what you would look for.
That would probably be one of my priorities. But yeah, just human nature. Yeah, the freaking out part would definitely be in there.
Definitely. Yeah. And Brad's saying if it looked like the island in the picture, I'd freak out a lot though. Yeah, because I think there'd be room for you and maybe three other people total on the island with like one tree. So yeah, not much to work with there.
Yeah, it would depend. If you had the size of the island and the number of companions. I mean, is it inhabited?
Mm. I mean, if you think about it, all of North America or even like the Americas are an island. Technically, it's surrounded by water. It's just one giant island that we call a continent. So that's a good point. How big is the island? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for participating. We thought we'd mix it up a bit with a bit of an unrelated, fun question. That being said, we'll go ahead and jump into today's wisdom talk. We have Braj joining us live from Silicon Valley. Braj is an extremely smart, talented individual. He graduated college and now works at TikTok as a machine learning engineer at the age of, what's your age now? You're like less than me.
20.
20. Yeah, at the age of 20. I was still in college at the age of 20. So yeah, the extremely smart individual. And he's been practicing bhakti yoga for much of his life actually. And I think it's always really interesting to have him join us in Wisdom Wednesdays because he brings a Bhakti yoga perspective that is a lot more analytical, scientific than typical. And I think it helps us dive deeper into spirituality, but not just spirituality, but rather the science behind spirituality. So that being said, today's topic is about life and chemicals, and can you create life from chemicals? What are the different possibilities? So I think it'll be quite interesting. Braj, thank you for taking time out of your day to join us.
Thank you, Ayan. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. That was very, very, very kind of you. And I'll try to live up to that. Hello. I think this is my first time meeting all of you, other than of course Ayan. I know Manya as well. So feel free to, if you want to ask questions as I go through it, we can make it as interactive as we want because we're a small group. Let me just share my screen. Let me know if you can see that. Okay, perfect. And so I think last time when I came on here, I talked about the Big Bang. And today I'm going to be talking about can life come from chemicals? And the way I usually go about these is just a lot of thought exercises. And the goal is to just help you question what what your impressions are, what you've grown up with, what you might see in the media and so on, just to question things in a different way. Um, and and just to open your thinking. And so sometimes it can kind of come off as abrasive, um, but that's not the intention. It's just to like open our minds, especially when we talk about spirituality, because a lot of these um, questions can be quite conflicting on both sides. And so we don't want to ignore either side of the story. And this is a nice way to reconcile things. So just let me know if you have any questions as we go through it. I think one of the most fundamental differences that we have in our spiritual tradition compared to, let's say, scientists and science as a whole right now, it's that matter is energy, and rather it's energy that comes from the Supreme. And because of that, it's not a fundamental substance. It's like clay. It can take any form and it can hear like some structure, and then it can also be brought back to some amorphous state of clay. And so this idea that matter is energy is very, very important when we think about the Vedic side of it. And the way we can think of the universe and all these different creations, um, and the universal, as we say, the form of the universe that comes from God Himself is like this cosmic control system that organizes and governs all the beings by controlling the various elements, the modes, the senses, and of course, various different deities and so on. And so the Vedic paradigm essentially asserts that life creates matter rather than the other way around. And unlike the modern scientific viewpoint, where matter is deemed to create life, we think that it happens in the other way. And the reason this makes sense in the system is because, of course, matter is the energy of the Lord. And so when we think about life, life is this fundamental unit of consciousness, and that is separate from matter. And so that impregnates matter with movement and action and so on. And so matter is not necessarily independent, as we might believe here in our general realm of science. And so this is what the Vedic traditions generally say for how life connects with matter, and rather also the origin of life. And so I just want to talk about the other side of it now, which is generally the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution is not complete in the sense where that there's more before the theory of evolution. First, life forms from chemicals, and then from that primitive form of life, evolution takes over and brings about the rest of it. And so the history kind of starts, of course, with Darwin. So he was a very secluded person, and he was known to be a very critical thinker. And he was very cautious of sharing his ideas because he thought that it'd lead to potential backlash. And so he had observed various species on his various expeditions in South America, and then also theorized that species were not immutable or unchanging. Rather, they could evolve to higher orders. And so this was the fundamental basis of his theory of evolution. And Thomas Huxley, he was one of Darwin's greatest defenders. He was also known as Darwin's bulldog. That was his nickname. And without him, his theory would actually never have been mainstream. We would never have even heard of the theory of evolution without Huxley. And he was the one who went to academics, he debated, he publicized Darwin's theory all around the world. And so we have to give a lot of credit to him for bringing this theory to such a big mainstream audience, where now this theory of evolution is basically it just commonplace in all academic institutions. And the idea, the very, very general idea, this is what we learn in school, and in general as well, that there are mutations or these random changes in the DNA, which form some irregularities that generate a slightly variant organism or animal or person, whatnot. And then natural selection is that when a variant species is now dominant, so it the weaker iteration of it dies out and it's replaced by some higher order. And so this can essentially attempt to explain that we went from cells to humans by many iterations of this natural selection, where mutations would happen, you'd get a new variant, and then the old one that was inefficient would die out due to lack of resources and so on. And so speciation, this idea of a new species forming, is also a pretty complex phenomenon. And just defining it is very difficult because, of course, we haven't really seen this in real time. Rather, we've seen or we've observed the instances and circumstances where it feels like something might have happened. But generally, it's that they're reproductively isolated. That means they don't reproduce with each other. Now, the definition of can and won't is where there's a lot of debate. Can they reproduce with each other, or will they just not? And so that can lead to some variance in how we define our species, but this is more technical in that way. And so one might ask, is life nothing but matter? If we were to consider this entire timeline that is given, where let's say the Big Bang happened, you have this primordial soup of atoms that slowly combine to form, let's say, a cell now, a living cell. And then that living cell, with the process of evolution, becomes who we are today. Then is life really nothing but matter? And we bring two considerations to this to challenge this point, where, first of all, living beings are quite complicated. We as humans are very complicated, but even very like one-celled amoebas, they are also extremely complicated. And secondly, living beings are conscious. And so this element of consciousness has to have a source as well. And so there's another presentation I have where I talk about that in more detail. But one might, let's just assume for the rest of this that let's believe that we're conscious and the phenomena of consciousness, which are these qualitative experiences we have, are inexplainable according to matter. And so then how can we try to explain these things if it's only matter? And so these are the two main avenues where I attempt to challenge your thought and also my thought that I had. And so firstly, we talk about, can life come from chemicals? And on a purely physical level, scientists argue that life is chemistry. Biology, the study of life, actually used to be a descriptive subject where scientists would observe things, write them down, and then continue to observe more things and write down their experiences, their descriptions of things. And then slowly, after chemistry was more developed under the notion of physics, biology became more about chemistry. And so life has become now chemistry. It's all about the mathematics and the physics that is underlying all the different phenomena that we see, or that a biologist might see. And so we wonder, how was life formed? You have this primordial soup of atoms. They combine to, let's say, make molecules. Our body is made of molecules. And so do atoms make life? And in fact, if they do, how would they do it? And so the very simple analogy for atoms is like the Tinker Toys. You might have played with this in chemistry class or just in general. You might have seen them around. But the idea is that these atoms are like these these units, and then you can combine them to make molecules. And then you'll have, if you start sticking them at random, let's say you have a bunch of atoms, you stick them in random using this Tinker Toy set that you have, you will get some characteristic shapes. You'll get some squares, you'll get some triangles. Maybe you might get a pentagon or a hexagon. And then you might say, okay, just real quick, in like 2 minutes, I've developed all these shapes. And so if I did this for 1 million years, could I get, I don't know what the big, is it the Space Needle that's big in Seattle? Because here I say the Salesforce Tower. Will you get the Space Needle in 1 million years after combining a bunch of Tinker Toys? And so we've made some progress with some shapes, some very basic ones. So like, why not a building in 1 million years? What's stopping us from doing that? And one might say, well, yeah, of course, yeah, you can just wait long enough, you'll get there. But what I'd like to say is that with Tinker Toys, you're bound to get specific angles. For example, you might get right angles, you might get 60-degree angles, and so on. And so in order to get squares, triangles, hexagons, whatever you end up with, that design is actually built into the parts. You can't just get the Space Needle from that. How are you going to build a curve of the Space Needle, for example? How are you going to build the different materials of the Space Needle? And maybe there's like an elevator now. How are you going to build gears and axles with just Tinker Toys? The design is not built into the parts. And so naturally, they'll produce these very basic shapes. But since the skyscraper is not necessarily built into the design, it would require some kind of external design that is built into the parts. And so let's say, okay, the design of everything is built into these parts. So you can have balls with holes for axles and wheels and whatnot. You can have rods of different shapes. You can think of it like a Lego set with no manual. You just have all the pieces, but you have no manual. And then this can be the same as almost like trying to solve like a jigsaw puzzle. You have all the pieces and you can put them together at random. And if the pieces don't go together, you keep trying, you find the next piece that goes with it, and then you put that together, and then that's how you build a puzzle. You find two pieces that connect, then you find a third that connects, a fourth that connects, and so on. And it's just a matter of time before the whole puzzle is solved. And it can be a very complicated puzzle because the shapes are such where like maybe there's only one or two options for everything, and you can link them together in that way, and then eventually you should solve them. But the idea is that if you have these puzzles, you can't start to build something completely new. So what we're saying is that only if the design is built into the parts, that means you have a puzzle set that is meant to be something, will it create something? If you have puzzle pieces where none of them link together, they won't automatically link together. If you have a bunch of Tinker Toys, you're not going to automatically build the Space Needle. And so unless that design is built into the parts, there is no reason for you to get that structure by random operations. And so that design needs to be pre-built or just even pre-thought of just before the actual process of evolution. And so we'll get into that in a little bit. The Stanley Miller experiment was the most famous one, and this was conducted at UC San Diego, where Professor Miller, he took some ammonia, methane, and water vapor, and he put it into a big flask. You can see the flask behind him over here. And then he put like an electric spark through it for a few hours, and he noticed that it became some brownish gunk. And after analyzing it chemically, it included amino acids. And so there are 20 different types of amino acids, and these are no, not 20 different types of amino acids, but yeah, actually, wait. 20 different types of amino acids, but there are proteins that are created from amino acids. And so the basis of proteins are amino acids to some level. And these proteins are very important molecules in our body. In fact, like our hair is a protein. Various different operations and parts of our body are built of protein. And so from this, immediately people started saying, well, throwing together molecules at random in just a few hours, we were able to get amino acids. So if we keep doing it for millions and billions of years, can we not just originate life? Can that primordial soup just become life? And then after that, evolution will happen. It'll produce every single organism that we know today. And all of this will simply occur by chemistry. And so this is the idea of whether life can come from chemicals. But as we just discussed, unless the design is built into the parts, even though you can build some simple characteristic structures, to build something as complex as a building or whatnot is a much more difficult task. And so now to talk about that part, I will go into a little bit of the complexity of life at a very, very small scale. So amino acids, as I said, are not very complex. They're like Tinker Toys, like the very simple ones you can build randomly. But a simple, a simple like single cell bacteria is a completely different story. It's a very complicated structure. I think you can see it in this image over here. There's so many different parts to it. And even supercomputers actually are not as complicated as a single bacterium because supercomputers are repeatable. They have very simple parts that are combined at a large scale. Whereas these cells, every single molecule as well is quite complex. So these different parts in it are called organelles. There's like the nucleus, there's the Golgi apparatus. There's so many different organelles in here. And the more closely you look at these components, the more complicated it becomes. And even if you look at the electron microscope level, where you're looking down at the level of molecules, things are very, very intricate in a cell. When you look at a machine, for example, now, from far away, it may seem very simple, but when you get close up, it's more complex. And then for man-made machines especially, eventually it becomes a lot simpler. Once you get down to the level of molecules, it's quite crude. Even before the level of molecules, it's quite crude. You're going to see very simple structures, whereas with the cell, it's completely different. For example, we can look at the cell wall. So it looks like a slab. This is like a picture of a cell wall. The different colors are different molecules. You can think of it like a fabric. It's like linked together to produce this rather protective layer. And so unlike ordinary cloth, though, the cell wall can grow. The bacteria is able to reproduce, so it's able to create new cell walls. And so there is a manufacturing process where molecules are come together and then they're woven together in this format to create a cell wall. And this is necessary for a cell to even exist. And so each of these colored shapes, even though it looks quite simple here, are very complicated on their own. Hundreds of atoms need to be structured in a very specific way for that cell wall to retain its rigidity and also to protect the inside of a cell. And without a cell wall, there would be no cell alive. They would die very quickly, and they need to reproduce really quickly to stay alive. And so, in order for life to even exist today, the cell wall had to be produced somehow at such a high, complicated level. Another interesting operation of a cell is DNA gyrase. And so a bacteria basically reproduces itself. And in order to do that, it has to copy the DNA. And so the DNA is basically, it's made of four different types of links, and it's like a strand that's scrunched up and stored in the cell. And this strand can be several thousand times the length of the cell. So it's quite scrunched up and it's folded up and so on. In order to copy it, you need to go down the entire DNA strand and then produce the copy for it. While you're going down, you are bound to produce tangles because now you need to separate it. Imagine you have two strings that are line by line, then you scrunch them up, and the string, let's say it's like a mile long, you scrunch it up into a little ball. Try untangling that immediately. And so scientists know that this is quite a complex procedure to untangle two DNA strands. And we still don't know how they eliminate those tangles. If you were to do it mechanically with like a robot in this case, like in a funny way, you have this robot that takes the green one and needs to put it under the red one. So the green string now it breaks it and then puts it back together. And so this is like a very simple robot that does this process of DNA gyrase. But when we look at it at a microscopic level in a cell, there's only a protein that we see that does this, but there's no actual knowledge of how this process exactly happens. And if this doesn't happen, the bacteria, again, cannot reproduce. And so they'd have very short lives, and it would break down this entire theory of evolution. And so these are just some examples to show how complex the cell is and how much we still don't even understand about it, while we understand much more complicated looking machines at this level. And so again, it comes back to that question, can you really create this from just a bunch of tinker toys? And now if we go to the evolutionary process, so we've talked about, can life come from chemicals? Now we talk a little bit about the next steps. Let's say you have a cell. How are you going to produce a human over a series of 1 billion years or whatnot? The key question or the key principle that we go by are, what are the steps? How did it even get this ability in the first place? For, let's say, some new ability, how did I get the ability to walk in the first place? And then in the case of bacteria, we can talk about like the cell wall. How did it get the ability to create such a strong cell wall that it won't die so quickly? And then one might say, well, there was some earlier kind of bacteria that had a different arrangement that we don't know, because we see the current version of it, but we don't know the earlier version. And then this arrangement that we see right now eliminated the previous one because it was better. And then the previous one was simpler. And you can keep going back. You can say the previous one was simpler, and the one out before that was simpler, and so on. But if you really think about it, it's all a bluff. Because what are those previous arrangements? What are the steps? So this is a very important question that we ask. The method of going from one species to another is basically like a series of mutation, or that's the argument. And these mutations are like zaps of DNA that introduce some new arrangement in the cell. And it's argued that by a combination of mutations, you can achieve some better arrangement that can eliminate some prior arrangement. These mutations generally occur during reproduction. Either there's an error in the DNA copying, or there's some radiation involved, or when there's a combination of genes sometimes. Of course, with bacteria, there's no combination of genes. It's directly reproducing itself, but like with humans and whatnot, there are combinations of genes. And so this is how a mutation is created. And so with the series of mutations, it's argued you get a new kind of species. And so I'm going to bring another example over here. There's a town in Japan called Aichi, and inside of there's a neighborhood called Toyota, where the Toyota factory exists. And this factory is controlled by some computer that operates according to the instructions encoded in the software, which is binary, and it directs everything. It directs all the different robots. It directs all the various operations in there. And then the result of the factory is a new Toyota car. And so imagine I zapped a bunch of bits in the software randomly. Will I get a better Toyota? I might. Who knows? Maybe. At some point, I might get a better Toyota. I might have found the best algorithm to make it. I'm forgetting the name of the book, but there's this idea that there's a 400-page book of random letters. One of those books is the formula of the world. It just has to, 400 pages of random letters. One of them has got to be really good. And so same here, like maybe one of the zaps did something and I got the best Toyota possible. However, can I make a new machine from the output? Can I now make a Toyota with a snowplow at the end of it? Is that possible by just zapping the bits? It's really not possible, because you'll need to incorporate that design into the factory. Just by zapping bits, you can only get a certain threshold of variation, but you really can't do so much. You can't go beyond it. You can get someone taller and taller and taller, but then there's a limit. You're not, by evolution, basically, we're not going to get a 50-foot human at the end of the day, or we're not going to get a human with like very unique abilities to fly or whatnot. And so an engineer can easily design a factory to make that snowplow, but it can't happen randomly. Or rather, I would ask you, can it happen randomly? And it does not seem very plausible. And so the organic being, or like this organism that we think of, we can say, well, it's not a machine. It's like soft and pliable, and it's, it's lively and so on. But if you think of it from a very material perspective, which is the approach science generally takes, it's not so. It's just another machine, really. And so in a reductionist sense, it's like another machine that's produced from a factory. And one might say, well, how about this machine the machine that you were talking about here can produce itself? There's actually a book on this. Von Neumann, he wrote a book designing a machine that could produce itself. And so that's very similar to what we're proposing here with the cell. And so it is possible with the machine. If you zap that machine, you're not getting a new self either. And so this idea of softness and pliability of an organism really comes from our own impressions of life rather than what the scientist rather than the approach the scientist takes. In reality, if we think of it from just a material perspective, it's just completely rigid with very rigid patterns. And so I'll take another example over here. We talked about the snowplow one, but let's talk about an actual bacteria. It's called E. coli. You have millions of them in your intestines, and probably like, I don't know, in this call, we maybe have like 100 million just among us. And so it's got a flagella, which is this like tail thing that sticks out, and it can actually propel itself in water using this flagella, almost like a submarine. And in an electron microscope, it kind of looks like a motor. It's got like an axle and a disc, and it can go forward and reverse. And E. coli has some, you could say, some simple form of intelligence. It likes some chemicals, it swims towards it. It doesn't like some chemical, it swims away. A very simple form of intelligence of like and dislike. And now the question is, how did it generate a flagella? How did that happen? And the idea is that it's a sequence of accidents. There was some bacterium without a flagella, without this mechanism of propelling itself. And then it became one with flagella through a series of mutations and generations. And by natural selection, because it has a propeller, it's able to eat up the nice chemicals much quicker than the one without a motor in it. And so gradually it produced the structure. But then again, we can ask, what are the steps? How exactly did we get from one side to the other? And if we were to say that this eventually happened through natural selection, that new structure would become dominant and it eliminates the previous iteration. So maybe we don't have that iteration. But again, the question comes, what are the steps? And let's just understand, can it even happen? If we were to just accept that it can happen because it's possible, that's not very logical of us. Just because it's possible doesn't mean that it can happen. And we can actually prove in some cases how it can't happen. If you look at electric motors, for example, they generally have like coils or magnets that help it pull in like a circular motion when you put some electricity through it. We don't exactly know how an E. coli motor works, but they think it's like a turbine with a molecule rushing through under pressure. So let's try to build that. And so we need some special blade now to run this turbine. If you have a turbine with the wrong blades, it just doesn't even work properly. And it's got to be tilted at a specific angle. And then how do you achieve that randomly? How do you get this perfect blade randomly? Even if you have the blades working, but not the axle. Let's say there's no axle, you just have a bunch of blades that are just moving at random, or you have the wrong pressure, it still won't work. So it requires a very specific arrangement to work. And if there exists, let's say, some intermediary stage where the entire motor is not fully developed, but some part of it is, let's say it's got blades, but it's not got the axle working, then it's just spinning its blades randomly, not connected to anything, and it just wastes energy. If it even loses out 1% of its energy to its competition, let's say its previous iteration, it will actually die out, or rather, it'd be half the population of the previous iteration in just 70 steps. In 70 generations, just because it's performing 1% less, it'll now be half of the other generation. And so clearly, by having this intermediary stage where it's slightly better, slightly worse off, is not very doable. But it has to reach some intermediary stage to get to that final step of having a fully functioning motor. So any motor that's not fully functioning would essentially be rendered useless. It would die out before it even got to a stage of having a motor that worked. And so this is a very interesting kind of thought exercise where can it even really happen? Because we can show an example here that it may not happen. And so one might say eventually it will succeed. We just need to wait long enough. But then again, the question is, how long do we need to wait? If it's just left up to chance to generate all the organisms on Earth, we don't have enough time with the Big Bang's timeline. 13.8 billion years is just not enough, where I think around 3 or 4 billion was actually left for building life. And so scientists recognize this themselves, and they say that these are highly likely mutations. For to generate a motor is highly likely. It's not just uniformly left to chance. And so this is another question where we have to wait so long in order for it to succeed, where we have a time limit. And so that also seems quite implausible. And so yeah, this is the thing about probable mutations. And so then when we talk about these probable mutations, what are the steps? How did we go from a E. coli without a flagella to E. coli with flagella? How exactly did that happen? Just by saying that it's fairly probable, there's no indication of what exactly those stages are in the development of the bacteria. And so biological systems are different from man-made machines. And so that is what is generally said. But they work exactly the same as man-made machines on a purely physical level. It's just chemistry, physics, and matter. And so again, what are the steps? When it comes to talking about these topics, we've talked about these various discussions of life and chemicals and evolution and so on a very basic level with a lot of thought exercises. The scientific method generally goes about breaking apart things and then putting them back together to learn. It's like a child taking apart a clock. You put it back together, you understand the mechanics of it. And so using our senses, scientists can understand very medium-sized things. They can understand things that we can work with. Rather, for smaller things or very large things, we need microscopes, we need telescopes. To learn about things in the past, we need like carbon dating. But these methods are imperfect. They're not necessarily wrong, but they're imperfect. They're not complete. And they become more and more imperfect the more we try to extend the grasp, where if you're trying to go deeper with a microscope, the margin of error increases. And so the 4 principles we have towards scientific theories is that, number one, they can turn out to be quite speculative. They have certain defects, as we mentioned over here. They can't explain how this complexity comes about from nothing. And then, of course, when they go into higher dimensions, the Vedic versions that also propose similar higher dimensions are rejected. And so these are some principles that we can hold to ourselves. And so this idea of higher intelligence now comes in. These man-made machines that we have are built using higher intelligence, not higher, rather some intelligence. And so some intelligence existed prior to the physical organisms that we see. Bodies are made out of matter, and so some non-material intelligence has to be brought in, something that existed before these bodies were created. And there was an English philosopher named Hume. He argued that this intelligence does not need to be supremely intelligent, rather it can be like moderately intelligent, just a little bit better than human, but not necessarily godlike. And that's fine too. We were ready to start off there, but it had to have existed before the embodied entities. And so in our Vedic version, there's a supreme intelligent creator that has designed all these life forms. And then moreover, life is just beyond matter. It's invigorated by the living force of consciousness, but the fundamental unit of consciousness is the soul, or that's the name for it, which is the agent. This is the doer. And so this impregnates matter and brings it to life. And so God cannot just be understood by material observation, because we're trying to say that this intelligence that designed life has to be non-material, because it had to have existed before life was created. And so the real question is, how do we explain this? How do we even discuss these things? These are quite difficult. And when we think about explain, the word explain, it comes from the root plane and then x. So x and then plane. X means to bring out, and plane means plane. And so explain means to bring out the plainness of something. It's to make something ordinary. How is this ordinary to you? And it basically means to just make it familiar to someone. To explain a situation, it's about making it something that the other person can understand due to their own past impressions and experiences. And so when we think about explanation, we can actually connect that with causation. This philosopher, Spinoza, he made an interesting connection over here. If A causes B, then by understanding A, I can explain B. So this is kind of interesting. If A causes B, I can explain B by understanding A. And so to explain B, I can go to its cause. And so a complete explanation of an effect is found by identifying its underlying cause. For example, if you know a specific chemical reaction causes a flame, then understanding that reaction explains why the flame appeared. And so this is a way we can think about knowledge and explanation. And so in the Vedic version, in the spiritual version, there's an idea of God being the ultimate cause, the cause of all causes. And so if we were to accept that, then the phenomena of the entire world can be explained because we know the original cause of it. If we understand the effects of that cause and its underlying um, influence on various other aspects of the world, and we bring it down to its more minute levels, we can understand everything. We can explain everything. And so the explanation gap is when we try to explain things that are not ordinary. When we move upwards, let's say we're trying to explain something, we go to the next. So now we explain A with B. Now we need to explain this with something. We explain it with this. At some point, there's a gap. There's an explanatory gap or an explanation gap. This is very common in mathematics. It's called inferential gaps or leap of logic, where like an experienced mathematician might take a couple steps, might simplify a formula really quick, but I did not know what he just did there or what she just did there. And so it can seem simple to a mathematician, but for someone else, it can seem quite complex or unexplainable. And so by breaking it down, we're able to bridge that explanation gap. And this is also very common when talking about spiritual traditions, religious traditions in general. How do you explain something divine when everything around us seems so material? And so the idea is by approaching it from different processes of knowledge. The ascending process of knowledge is generally the path of science. You start off here, you explain that, and you keep going upwards. And you try to find the original cause by starting off with the phenomenon. So you're basically, this is what we call matching the data. You take data, you find a theory that explains that data. Now you have a theory, explain that theory, keep going up. And that's how you eventually find out maybe the science of the world. But it's very prone to explanation gaps because at some point you don't know what's next. There's no end to the frontier. You can keep going upwards as far as you like. And there's many different branches as you go upward. The descending process of knowledge is slightly different. It starts by acquiring knowledge from the source. And so we study how the source influences and creates other things. And eventually we can understand our current state. And we can understand what we are experiencing at the moment. So it's not as prone to explanation gaps because we start from the source. We start with the causation and then let that explain it to us. And so in order to resolve these gaps in the ascending process, which is the general method that we all take here, it's to make things familiar. Again, explain means to bring out the plainness of something. And so, for example, the TV was revolutionary in the 20th century. It was an exciting, fantastical phenomenon. But now it's a very ordinary thing. And it's a very plain experience. To watch TV is a very ordinary, plain experience. No longer surprising. And so similarly, these teachings of these ancient scriptures can also become familiar with us by basically letting them be out there, by showing them in their most bold, raw, true, pure form. And so we need to acknowledge a reality that is beyond our experience. And so what we did today was bring out these explanation gaps. We found these explanation gaps in what science has to say about life and the origin of life. And the way we can bridge those gaps with a different sect of knowledge is by making it familiar with us, by first of all acknowledging it, and then by making it familiar. integrative preaching was an approach the Catholic Church took, especially with the surge of science in the last 100 years, where they said Big Bang is the same as the "Let there be light" statement, and so all scientific theories of creation occurred, and then Jesus came and saved everyone, and so there's a lot of different holes in this. If it was all material from the beginning, why does anyone need saving? And it's prone to holes because you're grafting two different frameworks of knowledge and also of the world together. And so this doesn't actually address an explanation gap. It actually creates more kinds of gaps and more kinds of issues. What my spiritual master and then his spiritual master did was a different type of preaching. It was more bold. It was about making things familiar by bridging that explanation gap by just making it plain, making it ordinary to think of God, to think of something divine, to accept a creator, and so on. And so this challenges the tendency to think that what we learn is mythology or fake or a hallucination. Rather, it becomes more real the more we engage with it because it bridges that gap for us, and eventually it all clicks because that bridge is now crossed. And so when it comes to these concepts of origins and life and evolution and so on, there are these explanation gaps, but we can fill those gaps by making the other side of it a more holistic Vedic spiritual version that starts off with the creator more familiar to us. And so that completes the presentation over there. If you want some more notes, feel free to scan that QR code. It's a little technical, so up to you if you're very interested. But I'll leave it up to the questions right now. I know I wasn't able to see all of you, but I think I saw Graham and I saw whoever's on the iPhone. And so I enjoyed the expressions all throughout, but feel free to ask any questions or if you have any reflections and so on.
I'd have to say, I love your reference to the Space Needle. Of course, the Columbia Tower is actually taller now. A lot of us were born when the Space Needle was the tallest building in Seattle. But yeah, that's been long surpassed. But
Well, thank you for that information.
When you were talking about molecular structure and atoms, it brought to mind, I read several books by Deepak Chopra, who was probably, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he talks about Ayurveda, but he's an endocrinologist that is embracing Ayurveda. And he talks about quantum particles, which are, he doesn't talk about quarks and hadrons and so forth, the subatomic particles smaller than neutrons or electrons, but he talks about these quantum particles that shift back and forth between energy and matter. So I thought that was, I don't know, that seemed to just jog my memory from his books.
Thank you for mentioning that. All these kinds of examples, especially like when we start thinking about these phenomenon, it makes it even more, it makes it less absurd to think of matter as a whole being energy, and because it's accepted in some ways. So perhaps it could be all of it. So that's a great point that you made up too, over there. Thank you. I'll hand it back to you then, Ayun.
Thank you so much. No, this was really interesting, and it never fails to amaze me how we can take a scientific approach to something that seemingly people think is just faith-based or based on speculation, but rather you can actually think of it from a logical perspective and get to, the same conclusion that those with, faith might get to. Whether you're analytical, whether you're emotional, there's ways to reach the same conclusion. And the reason I love having you here is because you're able to take that analytical approach, which often we aren't able to get in Wisdom Wednesdays, and it just adds a new flavor of discussion to our series. I think it's, for me personally, what I always find interesting is the realization of if you keep backtracking, even if scientists claim they created something that can fly, or like you brought up the Toyota example, there's always an intelligence aspect behind it. Even if you say, oh, material elements were the things that created it, but like you mentioned, unless there's intelligence built into those material components, or like you also mentioned, a Lego kit without the instructions, it doesn't work out. And I think that's at least a key takeaway I'm going to be taking from today's talk, because I think it's really practical and a great way to look at things, everything around us, in the sense that it's created by intelligence. It's not created by matter. Matter is just the Lego blocks, but intelligence are the actual instructions.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Thank you for having me as well. I love coming here. It's really fun talking about all this.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining this Wisdom Wednesday, and thank you for sticking around. I think at one point we had like 11 people, but Wednesdays perhaps are busy days for people and they hop in and out. But again, thank you for sticking around and being part of the discussion. Hopefully you learned something new and got something out of it, either a new lens, a new dinner table conversation, whatever it might be. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Braj.